Welcome to the Intimate Partner Violence, what it is, what it can look like, and how we can help. This 90-minute training is brought to you by the Northeast Caribbean Addiction Technology Transfer Center. My name is Diane Padilla, and I am with you for the next little while. I'm a research project manager here at the Northeast Caribbean ATTC. We are working out of New York State Psychiatric Institute, Columbia University Medical Center. I do a lot of technical assistance around screening, brief intervention, referral treatment with organizations that are looking to seek to integrate this evidence-based practice. And so it's more than just training. It's really about ensuring that everyone builds their skills capacity to be able to facilitate expert. And I help organizations understand how they can integrate it within their infrastructure and how they account for it and how they can build for it and so on. I do very similar things for organizations who are seeking to advance equity and inclusion. And we do a lot of work around the class standards, culturally and linguistically appropriate services standards. And it's an outline of how folks can, steps that folks can consider, organizations can consider if they want to advance equity. And so I do a lot of work around that, and then a lot in between, not dissimilar from what you folks do with all the hats that you wear. Disclaimer, development of these training materials is supported by a grant from the Center of Substance Abuse Treatment and Substance and Mental Health Services. And we are very well known for bringing you the most current information, the most cutting edge information. And that's what we try to do. Back in the time when we used to disseminate information within 3 to 5 years, these days we do it anywhere between 2 or 3 months, just to make sure that it's current. So SAMHSA'S Technology Transfer Center. So we're funded to provide you workforce support. That's essentially what we do. And so while you folks are doing all that fantastic work with our communities in need around a lot of different situations, substance use, mental health, prevention, we want to make sure that you keep your licenses and your credentials. So we provide you these types of webinars. The topic of intimate partner violence seems to strike a chord for some folks. It can be a really sensitive issue for some folks. And so what tends to happen, some of the research has been showing this, is that when we're not in our official capacity, specifically in our routines with our client communities, where we're at a heightened stage and we're focused on the different things that we have to accomplish, the different types of counseling we have to do, the different types of group facilitation we have to do, and so on, we are in a more relaxed state in this environment when we are training. So in that relaxed state, what I have found in my experience is that sometimes experiences or memories get triggered here. So if something like that, and sometimes I have a visual, and I want to be mindful of that. And if that triggers, if something triggers up, what do you think you can do to take care of yourself? If something if we're talking about something that kind of hits home, or whether it's something that you witnessed with someone or something you've done in the past, I'm not asking you to share it, but what can you do to take care of yourself if that happens? And I'm open to any suggestions. What do you think you might be able to do if that happens to you? Tamika?
Sorry, maybe I can take a breath and excuse myself for maybe a couple of seconds, breathe, kind of ground myself, and come back.
That's an excellent idea. Thank you for that. Don't have to formally excuse yourself. You can just shut off the video for a couple minutes. So what I love about what you said is one of the things that a lot of clinicians work with is when folks who have been traumatized, there tends to be a physical reaction. Now, physical reaction occurs, the cognitive impact and the thought process, and sometimes flashbacks, and sometimes barriers, other mental barriers. So if you can breathe, in those moments when that gets triggered, and if you could take breathing exercise, kind of calm yourself, your body system down, you're more likely to be able to calm your mind down and be back present in the moment. So mindfulness, this is a good way. The breathing exercise is a good way to kind of slow down your heart rate. And when you slow down your heart rate, you can think clearer. And when you think clearer, you're more likely to be more present. Do you think most of you folks can work with that? Okay, awesome. Just want you to please take care of yourselves, okay? And on the other hand, if you have a lot of experience, I'm open that you add to it, okay? And if you just keep yourself safe, and that's the most important thing here today. All right, let me get back to my slides. So I always talk about language. We always try to use stigma-free or recovery-oriented language. Some folks call it people-first language because it really came from communities of persons who have disabilities. That's where the first people-first language came from. But recovery-oriented language, anything, the idea is to be more person-centered and more person-supportive and be more stigma-free. So we've noticed that using certain language over the years, after a while, even though that's what we learned back then, these days we know that it can be very impactful for our clients who are already coming in with a depletive, esteem and attitude. And so what we try to do is help encourage you all, and we try to do our darndest to practice it also, is to use affirming language. It's really about motivating folks and helping them feel empowered, and using affirming language to promote the practices that will help them do that. So all in doing that is just being more person-centered in that process. So intimate partner violence, this is a bit of a graphic, but it kind of really does make, really does speak to the different levels of prevention that we do. Even the addiction field, part of you as folks who are CASACs and social workers and those who work in and recovery support services, what we understand is there's different levels of supports that we can give the client community. So primary prevention is any action that prevents intimate partner violence from at least occurring. It's like the educational pieces that we give to our clients. The idea is to help them reduce overall likelihood that they will be a victim or be victimized by a perpetrator. And so secondary and tertiary prevention. So secondary is more about the efforts and more about being able to try to identify and intervene as early as possible in a potential abusive situation that our clients may have. So that's what secondary prevention is about. So we want to reduce the consequences, give them the supports they may need, provide them options so they can make informed choices and so on. Tertiary is a lot of damage may have already, the situation may have already progressed, some damage may have already occurred. So what we want to do is ensure that they have the health resources they need, the mental health resources they need. Again, provide options to treat potential violence that they may have incurred. And that can include, an array of different things. It includes safe housing, relocation, legal advocacy and such. And so more of this will come out as we go along. So first I wanted to ask, okay, so now I already spoke. I also should say, let me stop the share for a moment. So tell me folks, how do you define intimate partner violence? What do you understand that to be for you? Whatever you're, I'm good. Go ahead, Jacqueline.
I define it as any type of violence or danger to a person, regardless of your sexual orientation or whether you're married or not, just violence with whom you're in an intimate relationship with.
Okay. All right. Anyone else wants to add to that? Very good. It is, thank you for that. It's very specific to the intimacy point. Let me go to my slides and let me just share just a moment of a little bit of a distinction between the other term that we usually hear. That's used interchangeably. So domestic violence versus intimate partner violence. Before we define, take Jacqueline's definition, domestic violence was the first term referring to violence between partnerships, relationship in romantic relationship. It was first came out many years ago. It was something that was typically recognized in marriages. And marriages back in before the 1970s, even at that era and in societal perspective, it was very specifically considered between a man and a woman. Usually the man was the perpetrator and the woman was the victim. But because of the years of women's rights activist groups and women's rights groups, they started to get involved and a lot of advocacy and a lot of legislation coming through and shelters and all types of resources became available behind the advocacy for victims female victims of domestic violence, that gave us an opportunity in terms of research to go in and really explore the subject even more. And so what was learned is that at that time, maybe decades ago, romantic relationships may have been considered in a marriage, but romantic relationships have evolved quite a bit over time. It's not, domestic violence not necessarily just in a partnership or a romantic relationship. It can be a family member. It can be a child to a parent, the parent to a child. So it has to do with closeness and not necessarily with a romantic partner. And so domestic violence has started to, because it's a lot broader than what we initially thought it was. Intimate partner violence was the new term to refer to the violence that occurs within romantic relationships. And so that was introduced a lot later, and it really moved us away from thinking that abuse only happens within marital relationships, and got us into thinking about that the abuse was between two people who have a partnership, a romantic partnership or intimate relationship going on. And so that goes beyond, like Jacqueline was saying, goes beyond like gender identity, sexual orientation, marital status, it goes beyond that. So it really makes it a little bit, really makes it more robust. So in terms of what Jacqueline was saying, which she was really spot on, intimate partner violence describes different types of violence, different types of abuses. It could be coercive, it could be hostile, it could be violent. It does not necessarily have to be physical. And it has to do, intimate partner violence, IPV, because I'm going to use the acronym quite a bit now. It's really specific to either a current or a former intimate partner. And logistically, domestic violence is for folks who are close to each other. It could be family members and such. But intimate partner violence is within that romantic or that intimate partner relationship. And so IPV occurs across different groups, ethnic, economic lines, among persons with disabilities, whether it's a heterosexual community, whether it's non-binary communities, it happens in all different contexts. So I wanted to run through some of the statistics that actually evolved in 2019 and 2020 when the pandemic first hit and up until where we're at now. Domestic violence calls to law enforcement rose almost 10% in March and April 2020. That, that shelter in place created a huge barrier and a great opportunity for batterers and a huge barrier for victims. And it just increased the violence towards the victims. I'm going to keep saying the victims, even though most times that the victim has to be female, it's not always female. So I just want to be specific about that too. So about 1 in 4 women and nearly 1 in 10 men have experienced contact of sexual violence or physical or some kind of stalking from an intimate partner during their lifetime reported. And those are the ones who are reported. I will tell you as a researcher, I will tell you that most of the information that we have just gives us a pattern, gives us an idea. It does not necessarily pick up on absolutely every single detail because we don't survey. It's almost impossible to survey 332 million people in the population of the United States. So what I will tell you is that it gives us a pattern, and these are almost always more modest than what actually happens. And so when we're talking about 1 in 4 women, 1 in 10 women, those numbers, they're probably more, they're probably a lot higher than what we're showing here. Now, DV, I'm sorry to say, I forgot to say domestic violence. I'm using the terms because this is straight from the literature. And so I am using the terms interchangeably, domestic violence, intimate partner violence. But IPV support requests from Spanish women spiked by 700%. So during the pandemic, it created such an environment all across the globe that we saw in Latin specific or Spanish or women who were from Spanish speaking countries, the call for had increased by 700%. Which is phenomenal. Never see anything like that. So the confinement risks increase the risk to the safety, right? So financial anxieties were part of it, being in close quarters, that increased the chances of health concerns. There was there's a lot of other stresses like loss of jobs at the time, gun sales. when they talk about the gun sales, around that time, gun sales across the country increased at a 41%. Huge. It's not even talking about the shootings that were going on lately. I'm talking about what was going on at that time to protect their homes in that confinement risk. What happens in an atmosphere of fear. And so that really created a very, very tumultuous type of atmosphere for a lot of victims. In 2021, battered US women are at 75% less likely to die when they don't leave their abusers. Flip that to the other side, 25% of women who have left their male abusers, and this is mostly to males, have been victims of homicide at their hands. So American men are victims of domestic violence at 12% also. So over 43 million people, women, and 38 million men have experienced psychological aggression by an intimate partner at some point in their life. So we start to see that some of these more current numbers are showing more specific, more higher numbers of impact of abuse for both males and females. National lifetime prevalence rates of violence by race and ethnicity, and what you can see here, women, white, Black, Asian, by different cultural groups. What you see here is the rates of having had at some point in their life, the rates of having been experienced with the violence. And that also includes the rape, physical stalking, and overall. And you see how these numbers are very high in these communities that tend to be typically underserved. And so while this is kind of framing out the landscape, I kind of want to give you something that was heard in one of the calls. So I am talking a lot, so can I have a volunteer to read the next slide? Can someone just raise their hand?
I can do that. I'm Margaret.
Okay, thanks, Margaret. Here you go.
Hotline call. The woman's partner had never threatened her with a gun before, but when she told him she had to go to work during the COVID-19 outbreak, he refused to let her. The woman told her partner that she had to go if she wanted to keep her job. Then he took out his gun and began to clean it.
So this is what happened in a situation. This is a hotline. This is a real call. With this woman, he had never done that before. He didn't say a word. He just, thank you, Margaret, for reading. He didn't say a word. He simply, after he told her not to go, when she defended her, her reason for going, all he did was took out his gun. So what do you call that? What's your feedback on that? What's your take?
Control.
Mm-hmm. What's he doing right there?
Intimidation.
Yeah.
Threatening violence.
Threatening and intimidating.
Yeah. So I see a couple of hands up. Emily, go ahead, and then Stacy.
Yeah. So threatening violence, intimidating her with a visual presentation.
Yeah. And it's just like the first person who said control. It's definitely about that.
Yes, control and creating fear.
Yes, there's terrorizing there. That's a form of,
there.
right. There's a form of control. Thank you both. Thank you, everyone. So it's not like it has to be specifically that someone picks up their hand and beats someone else over the head. It's not necessarily like that. There is the coercion, the terrorizing, is all part of the control. And so these things, and she had the ability to call. We don't know if she would have the ability to call anymore after that. Let me see. I had something. So the hotline saw a slight dip in the number of calls during the week of March 16th, but the calls have since gone back to a normal state. She's not sure whether the dip occurred because victims could not get away. So this came from a person who works the hotline. And what she ended up sharing was, and in that publication that I read, was that she's not sure if the calls weren't as high after a while because victims didn't have an opportunity to get to the phone afterwards. So there's no accounting for why the calls were really high at one point and then maybe not so high afterward. See, what happens a lot of times with a person who does like to keep control, the perpetrator, particularly in an intimate partner violence situation is they don't cope very well with the lack of control. So not being able to cope with not controlling that person, certain heightens their state and how they may continuously or maybe progress in how they coerce and control a person. So some more information. So what can IPV look like? So we have different types of abuse. And so add to this what you know. So physical abuse is any intentional and unwanted contact with you or something close to your body. And sometimes abusive behavior does not cause pain. And interestingly enough, there are times where the person will be abused and it happens that the physical marks are strategically not noticeable. That's not an accident. That is not an accident. There's other intersecting layers to this that we'll uncover. And so it may not leave a bruise that's visible to someone. So imagine someone who might think about or try to say something about a potential partner that maybe some members or some communities, some social circles know, and people may not believe it because they never see a bruise on the individual. But the individual will have the bruises in places where they probably can't show, you know? So, but any type of physical abuse, even pushing and shoving, even without hitting, pushing and shoving, that is abuse. Sexual abuse, well, the one that we're most familiar with, there's physical abuse and sexual abuse. So it refers to any action that pressures or forces someone to do something sexually that they don't want. So someone can be close to you, someone can be around you in immediate proximity, and they can still be and start to kind of crowd you in your space, and you may want them to step away and they still do it anyway. That's sexual abuse. You know, unwanted kissing or touching, unwanted rough or violent sexual activity, rape or attempted rape. Another way where in some dynamics, I'm going to tell you that this, and I don't want to mislead you, but it's like when it comes to perpetrating abuse, it's an opportunistic approach. So the different opportunities that present depending on the dynamics with that other person, with the victim, those are the things the perpetrator will take advantage of. So let's say there's HIV and the person has HIV and maybe refusing to use condoms with that person, you put in a more and putting that person at risk of getting infected with HIV. That can be part of the sexual abuse. Restricting someone's access to birth control, keeping someone from being able to protect themselves from STIs. There's the other thing, and we've seen this in a lot of legal situations that have come out as sexual abuse is if a person, even if a person is drunk and is not able to say no, if the sexual contact with someone is drunk or unconscious, otherwise unable to give a clear or uninformed yes or no, it's still sexual abuse. And these days it's recognized in the legal courtroom. Emotional abuse is another type of abuse. What I'm going through here are, I'm explaining them in isolation, but they all intersect to various degrees depending on the situation. So emotional abuse is threatening a partner, his or her possession or loved ones, harming a partner's sense of self-worth to gain and maintain control of the relationship. I had a client one time, and one of the things she told me that the person she was with before she came into treatment, one of the things she told me that she experienced was when her partner, she would run away from her partner every once in a while, and he put out the word that her son had died to try to bring her out. So, and he was very intent on speaking to the different people that they were both used to connecting with. So even though he couldn't find her, he was creating emotional abuse because he was threatening, he was trying to bring her out by saying her son had died. So these are different tactics that a perpetrator uses. So examples include, but are not limited to name calling, intimidation. This can be in front of people, belittling someone in front of someone else. Isolating a partner from their friends and family is a really big aspect that we see commonly in situations of intimate partner violence. Part of the coercion that happens for some folks, for some perpetrators rather, is that they will use slowly and insidiously would distance their partner or the victim from any other potential supports. Family members who were close, friends who were close, they tend to isolate them from that person. That's part of the coerciveness of abuse. And then we know also let me go back here, verbal abuse. And how many folks have had experience with clients who may have had a partner or a client who has shared with you that their partners speak to them in this way, that they belittle them and they call them stupid. Worst thing is like when that happens in front of people, really demoralizing. So it's a way of instilling fear and creating and just ensuring that that other person stays submissive to their demands, to their control. And so whether it's for self-gratification or for whatever the reason, it's just imposing someone's will over another one. And so another abuse is economic abuse, limiting a partner's access to assets or concealed information and accessibility to the family finances. We've had clients that work a job. They can't touch their salary once they get it because the perpetrator would take it. We've had, I had a client one time where she was telling me, what was it? She would get she was unmedicated at the time, or rather on welfare at the time. And she was trying to be in treatment while trying to get herself back together again. And she, the first couple of checks that she had received, she couldn't get it at the check cashing place because someone else had taken it out, before she had a chance to, and that was her ex-partner. So it's interesting how, these opportunities, again, quote unquote, have been part of the abuse that some partners have bestowed on their victims. And sometimes they'll give them an allowance, just give them just enough money for them to survive so they can continue to go to work, or they'll tell them, this is what you got to get to the store, exactly these items, this is how much you have, this is all you can get, things of that nature. Does this sound familiar to any one of you folks? Ah.
Yeah, I've had it happen in facilitating a permanent supportive housing program for chronically homeless people, and having intimate partners, former, really come in and influence and try and take advantage of their housing or their incentives. And often be like, oh, it's a street debt or something such as that. I protected you on the street, so this belongs to me now.
Wow. And that, the toughest part is for them to get themselves, go through the paperwork and get separated without letting the other person see where they're at, so they can start the paperwork and find a different way to get the payments. I mean, the system completely changed today, but that kind of tells you when I was doing direct services. I also had another situation where, a person had already, graduated and left the treatment program, and she had already done well. She had the partner violence issue in the past, and at one point her credit started to fall, and she somehow got a bill for, I don't know, a mortgage, I think it was. Somebody, her ex-partner apparently had forged her name, used her credit, bought a whole new home and a new car under her name. And she had to go through a lot to unravel that mess. So economic abuse can really put somebody in a really pressured state where they're at today, whether they're with the person or were with them in the past. So digital abuse. So a lot of times we find this with the younger population too. Nearly half of all younger 14 to 24-year-olds report being electronically harassed in some form. Almost up to 40% of incidences of digital dating have been reported, and there's a smaller percentage, 11 to 12, 13%, I think, have reported having had pictures of themselves naked just shared out on the World Wide Web. So digital abuse is the use of technologies such as texting, social networking, bullying, harassing, stalking, just to intimidate a partner. And the worst thing about the World Wide Web, as much as I love the World Wide Web, the one thing about working with the internet is that once information goes out there, You can't take it back. It leaves a digital footprint. And so it's tough. And so when we see, folks who have had their nude pictures or even nude pictures and their faces embedded on top of a nude body, and then spread out. It's very much along the same lines. So this is type of digital abuse that do exist, dictating who can't. And the other thing is, if someone is in an intimate relationship and a person has the victim has some kind of social FB or Instagram or Twitter account. So social media does have a way where a partner can actually come in, break the password, and go in and kind of stalk them from there to see who they contact, who they talk to, what it is that they post. We've heard of situations where perpetrators have hacked their partner's website, their account, and put all kinds of weird things up there. So the whole thing is to be able, again, to control even digitally that person, let that person know how they are still in there, they're still watching them. Creates a fear to even use any of these different potential resources. 49% of young people surveyed say that they have been electronically harassed in at least one of many of these digital ways. And this was in an older survey. Psychological. So any act, including confinement, isolation, verbal assault. And it's interesting because confinement, isolation, the first thing I think of is the pandemic. So that wasn't, but that's not imprisonment. We were sheltering in place. It's interesting how I had, and I have some friends who used to say, we're on lockdown. I said, don't say lockdown. We're not on lockdown. We can walk out to the front door. Lockdown is very different as the people at Rikers. Lockdown is very different, but confinement and isolation, when it's not your choice, when it's not for your health, when it's to control, is a completely different issue. And so the psychological impact on someone of being confined, of being isolated from people they know, from being told when they can come outside, when they can't. A lot of times some women or some males cannot go outside unless they're with their perpetrator. So this is the impact of a collective of different tactics. So humiliation, infantilization, any other treatment which may diminish the sense of dignity, integrity for someone. It also does something to the mind where the person starts to lose their sense of not just their worth, but their sense of groundedness, where they start to question themselves, when they start to believe what the perpetrator says. This is coercion after a long period of time. So it's making them think there's something wrong with them. Let's see, I had this one young man who said his partner used to, when they were using, they used to, before he came into treatment, but when him and his partner were using, there were times where he would leave the immediate area in one room, right? And then come back and all of a sudden everything switched around. And the partner would pretend that everything was exactly the way it was. And actually playing with his mind, making him think like this and like, he needed to depend on him because he was losing his mind. It is really interesting, this psychological coercion that is so depleted for any given individual and how the tactics are used. So the impression that makes someone feel crazy, like they're not grounded, like they can't, they may not be able to make decisions, they may need to stay very close to the perpetrator, mocking the person, imitating them, things of that nature. So when you mentioned earlier, the power and control wheel, this is pretty much what we're talking about. And so it could be physical violence, all kinds of different types of violence. It's all about power and control. And these are, and what you see around here is a lot of what we just spoke about, but these are all opportunistic. These are all types of different factors that can create an opportunity for the batterer to take advantage of that person to keep them under their power and control. We also see the power and control for the LGBTQIA community. And so the other, so we see a lot of the same things, but with the very specific factors that can happen in that environment. There was, and this was created a while ago. This was back in 2006. And this was before the advancements of a lot of the wonderful medications, the PrEP and stuff that we have today. And even in that sense, and I think about how sometimes a person can keep the medications away from an individual, thinking of someone who may not be out to all persons in their family, using that as a threat to coerce them. There's so much opportunities that a perpetrator can take advantage of. You see it as power and control wheel. So what do people say? And this is the question I got for you folks. And I know we're very intelligent, we know about this, but what are some of the reasons why victims stay in those situations? Tamika?
I mean, there's many, but I mean,
Give me one.
Fear, and after a while, you have no sense of self-worth and believe that this is all that you know and have.
Sounds like you're talking about learned helplessness, you know, to a certain degree. And when you do, some victims who have been in the situation for a long time, they're so fearful and existing in that state of mind for a long period of time, a person can actually lose the opportunity or the cognitive ability to be able to maybe decide to leave or do something different. It's not always about leaving, but to do something different. Thank you, Tamika. Lisa Marie.
Yes. So given the isolation and all the other forms of control, there may be no way out that the person can see as viable. No family support, no friends, no job, no, you know, there's nothing out there, and at least she has something right there, even though it's torture, with years of brainwashing, you know, that she
Yeah.
truly believes that there are no other alternatives.
Lack of resources and knowing where to go to get help or whatever. Yeah, thank you, Lisa Marie. Dean.
Yeah, it's interesting. When I was teaching the 350 CASAC program, one of the courses was domestic violence. And it was interesting because there were some folks in there that it kicked up some stuff for. And there was a gentleman there that just had this attitude of like, well, why don't they just leave? And a student self-disclosed, as a victim, at least I know where my perpetrator is. I don't have to look over my shoulder. I don't have to look behind the bushes. And that was like so eye-opening for even myself, because you always hear that. Why don't they just leave? Why do they stay? Because you know when and where that person is, and you can predict, you know, from body language, so on and so forth, their reactions. And it was really eye-opening when she said that.
Thank you for sharing that. That sounds like some of the victims that I've worked with. I used to be the domestic violence liaison in one of my past career moves. And one of the victims that I shared, I worked with, what she used to say is that it's very similar to what you're saying. And what she said is that she tried leaving, but not while she was trying to survive. And while being away from him, she was always looking over her shoulder. She didn't sleep. She couldn't eat. She couldn't maintain anything. She was so fearful that he would come and find her and just beat the living daylights out of her. And that's kind of like how she felt. Jacqueline, I see your name. I'm gonna put you. I'm gonna call on you. Then Stacy.
Hi, sorry, I'm a dinosaur. I don't know how to do the hand thing. So I just had a patient on Monday who had a physical domestic violence incident, and they didn't live together, but they were a couple. And he beat the holy crap out of her, stabbed her with a knitting needle. She goes to the hospital. The very next day, as his intimidation, her sister at work, at her job, was robbed. Somebody stole her pocketbook. He calls her and tells her that'll happen every week if you press charges.
Wow. Yeah. Yep. Stacy, go ahead. Thank you, Jacqueline. Stacy?
I just wanted to add that what I'm finding is that they feel stuck. And although they verbally are able to articulate what they want, what their plans are, and even a strategy, emotionally, they are stuck. And they find it easier to stay there and deal with this than to step out of that zone into another zone where they have no clue how they're going to survive. And that's really scary for a lot of these individuals.
It's easier to navigate through a world that you're familiar with, despite the insanity and the pain and the horror, than it is to go into the unknown. That might be just as terrorizing as well. Thank you, Stacy. Dr. Mary?
I was just going to add that sometimes it can be embarrassment, can be another reason that people don't leave, especially if you're dealing with a professional or someone that, you know, works in the field that, you know, for lack of better terms, people may feel, well, you deal with this every day, so you should respond differently. So I just wanted to kind of add that sometimes it's embarrassment, or you may have family members that have, you know, made comments pertaining to that there may be some red flags. And so it could be embarrassment of not responding earlier. So I think that's something to consider as well.
An interesting point. Thank you. Embarrassment and possibly humiliation. Tamika?
I was just a quick piggyback, a thought that rang into my mind when the previous lady was speaking was hierarchy of needs. I just, like you said, the reason sometimes people stay is just like you said, you got to satisfy those hierarchy of needs.
Mhm.
And the lady was saying, you know, she had, unfortunately, it wasn't the best, but it was, she still had the shelter, she still had the food, and you know, so that just rang a bell really quick.
Yeah, and even just the idea of change, the change of possibly maybe sometimes when an individual does have some knowledge of that resource or that knowledge comes to them, and just the idea of what they have to go through to transition, also it can be a huge impact, a huge burden for them to carry. So this is really good. Let me go to what I have on my slides. It's all, it has to do with what you all mentioned. So fear of leaving is also losing custodies of the kids, or how are they going to survive if that is the only means of support. Low self-esteem, source of income, maybe unaware, and you've mentioned this many times, of being unaware of options, you know, of possible supportive resources, or even how they may work, not even knowing. Maybe a lot of men and women have heard of shelters and domestic violence or intimate partner violence, you know, support organizations, but not sure how that works. Could they even take a chance to make a call, and how long would they have to go through that, you know, in order to get some kind of help? So there's a lot of lack of information. The traumatic impact of the actual incident is a huge one too, you know. So I wanted to, you know, just offer this. This is still what the research is still showing as part of what happens in a lot of the dynamics of intimate partner violence. The honeymoon period, the tension building, and the explosion. The honeymoon period has a lot to do with, you know, with someone at first, an individual, you know, you get to like someone, you know, you fall in love, you know, everything is kind of nice, and out of nowhere, something can happen. Bam. You know, it could happen that arguments can start, the tension starts to build, then there's an explosion, something happens, or there's an excuse, and the perpetrator reacts. And there could be violence, there could be yelling, a lot of hostility of different kinds. It doesn't always have to be physical, but but even if you think about not the physical, think about the yelling, think about someone in your face, think about, you know, the control of taking everything being taken away from you. Just kind of almost try to imagine, if you can, if you possibly can, how that can be so debilitating for an individual. So I can give you an example of this. So I had this one client, and she was doing really, really well. Part of what she did, she was in a domestic intimate partner violence for the last 6.5 years of her active addiction. And then she came into treatment, and she started her recovery process. She was doing all kinds of things. She was doing treatment. She was a resident. She was doing 12-step programs. She was getting employable skills. She was doing all kinds of things. And one of the things that she had, when she first came in, she was feeling fine. There was one time in the halfway house where she was we heard a sound. When we went upstairs, it was her. She had woken up from a nightmare, and she had dreams. She started to have dreams, backflashes in her dreams about the different violent interactions she had went through with him. One of the things she expressed with us was that there was, she remembered a time where she was hustling and she couldn't hustle up the money for them to get high. And so he threatened her and told her, in 20 minutes, you need to get us some money. And she was not able to to come up with the money in those 20 minutes. He in turn, he said he had called her over. She said the one thing that started to terrorize her is when he took his baseball hat and turned it around. So he turned it around and he said, come on, we're gonna go home. And he was slowly, intentionally put his arm around her and slowly, intentionally walked back to the house, very slowly. In that time, he's terrorizing her. And he would not allow her to speak. It didn't matter if she begged that she knew she was going to get a beating. It didn't matter how much she begged, he would tell you to be quiet. And she ended up being quiet until she got home, and then he would start to beat her. And so you see the honeymoon period, everything is nice. You see the tension building up, he terrorized her, and then he exploded. What happens after that is the other thing that's very, very common, is that after the beating, there's this other act that comes in. He starts to cry, I'm sorry I did that, please don't leave me, stay here. And that one glimpse of hope would help her forgive him, and she stayed. So when we think about when somebody stays, when we think about how debilitating, how coerced they have been, how psychologically impacted they are, this is just one example of a great, great, great many. She did a lot to get away from that lifestyle, and from what I understand, she's doing well today. But at that time, these are the dynamics that can happen. Substance use is not always part of the factors that are involved in this. It happens that when I was working in treatment, this is what she shared. But this is the kind of just an example of how the cycle of abuse can happen. And then when that I'm sorry comes in and those tears come down, then she's able to forgive him. There's something about a person who has been psychologically damaged to have one glimpse of hope that true love might actually be there, that things will actually change. That glimpse of hope, even though it wasn't real. And so, for the perpetrator's perspective, narcissism is part of it. Abusive people believe that they have the right to control and restrain their partners. It's the sense of entitlement that they have. And so this is just kind of some of the research that shows this. They often believe that their feelings and needs should be the priority in relationships. And so they use abusive tactics to dismantle their equality and to ensure that their partners serve them exactly the way they want. And so, and you know what's interesting is there are some programs for batterers. I've heard of programs that might be effective in helping someone learn skills to arrest their natural tendencies to want to control. I've not heard of any, I haven't looked lately, but I have not heard of those, any that are highly effective. And that would be interesting to kind of include in a future training. Physical symptoms, the most common injuries are headaches, insomnia, pain, choking, cessation, hyperventilation. Gastrointestinal symptoms is a huge part of it. And maybe sometimes what we need to understand is that when some of our clients do not necessarily they don't necessarily offer information on that. Listen, I'm in an intimate partner violence relationship. I want to talk to you about it. That's not commonly how it comes out, but what for us as providers, what we want to do is kind of be mindful that sometimes some of these physical symptoms that some of our clients may have might be linked to a potential situation like that. Have we asked those questions? Have we screened? Traumatic brain injury and non-fatal strangulation are often unrecognized forms of IPV and can lead to significant short or long-term neurological sequelae. So according to the National Center of Domestic Violence, Trauma, and Mental Health, high rates of DV among women with substance use, who are in substance use disorder treatment, go anywhere between 47 to 90%. High rates of DV among women accessing mental health treatment, about 30% in outpatient women in outpatient settings have reported partner violence. 33% in inpatient have done the same, up to 60% in psychiatric emergency settings. I do almost every year, I go to I present at the National Treatment Court Professionals Conference. And in the exhibit hall, you have a lot of different resources, how to, everybody's who's kind of trying to promote their products, whether it is toxicology tests or with the treatment programs. You also see a lot of these 12-step fellowships who have their own booths also and promote, giving them materials to help potential clients or participants in treatment programs. One of the statistics one time that I saw in the Narcotics Anonymous booth, they had done an informal survey of their people in their fellowship, and it indicated up to 95% potential, up to between 90 and 95% of persons in recovery had identified partner violence at some point in their life. So when we think about treatment and how many folks go into treatment who have a potential for having had some kind of traumatic experience with partner violence, we have a high percentage we're not always aware of. Is that something we should be mindful? Maybe because we don't always know that trauma shows up right away, or the symptoms don't not necessarily show up right away. So the mental health part of it is the major depressive disorders that show up, general anxiety disorder. Now, general anxiety disorder is something that a lot of people have and don't know they have. But there are times where it can be very impactful, debilitating, and people don't know that why they have a certain nature or why they behave or think or panic at certain points. It might be because of general anxiety disorder linked to a past, history of partner violence. Post-traumatic stress disorder is very specific, and it can go away with intervention, with help. And there's some other related disorders. The symptoms of PTSD, most of you folks are already familiar with this. Symptoms of PTSD are fear and anxiety. They tend to be shame and internalized guilt. Some of these symptoms, what they tend to do, they present not in the immediate first 30 days after having the last occurrence in a potential violence situation. It happens about, I think, 3 to 6 months afterwards. It's long, and these symptoms persist for a long period of time, can impact relationships, can impact a person's ability to have, sleep well and to concentrate, and they tend to persist for a long period of time. And so for more information on that, I certainly would suggest checking out the DSM-5. When a lot of times the symptoms include the hypervigilance. We've seen this with veterans. We've seen this where someone comes out of, maybe a veteran has been in 2 or 3 combat theaters where certain noises will, will create a reaction in them. This is not dissimilar for men and women who have been victims of partner violence over a long period of time. And so with post-traumatic stress disorder, that can happen as well. Sometimes certain noises or certain things that are associated with the hurtful events, the impactful events that they went through, those things can trigger a reaction. And so nightmares and memories, what I would tell you about that lady that was in the halfway house, what I would tell you is that it was in her nightmare that she realized that she was also sexually abused. She had omitted that part of her brain. Her mind had completely omitted it. It came out in her sleep. It came out in a memory in her sleep. And so PTSD has a way of impacting the mind where things come up at different times. It depends on where the person is at, if the environment is changing, if she or he is feeling support. And it depends on so many other different factors. This is a really, I use this in another training as well, but this is like really important. Someone who has had PTSD because as a result of a long period of partner violence can have been traumatized to a point that the mind does not have the same capacity that perhaps the average person mind has. And this speaks a lot to why some folks are able to make informed decisions in terms of considering different options to change the situation, or why some folks end up staying. So we know that the hippocampus and like the mid-area, the limbic system, the mid-area of the brain where memories are retained there, the associated feelings are retained there. And so when that shrinks after a long period of time, sometimes somebody will have those flashbacks or would have, Yeah, those memories where they can't distinguish between the past and the present, where they kind of are reliving the moment. They're not necessarily always able to distinguish past and present. And so the hippocampus, sometimes it's because that's happening because it's shrink. When that's also happening, the emotions that are tied to it increase. And so that fear, we think about fight, flight, and freeze. And so those reactions come because maybe the functions there are compromised, where the memory is so intensely embedded and still impacting the individual. And so the fear response may be reactive. They keep hypervigilance. They stay away from certain situations, or it can also be that they are so impacted that a situation like between 4 people, there's one person who has severe, PTSD because of the severe situation that she or he had with partner violence. And there might be a situation where everybody might be like emotionally reactive, and they might have a flat affect. It happens that the brain is not functioning very well. So the prefrontal cortex, where we make healthy decisions, that tends to shrink. Also, this is after a long period of time. So it'll shrink down, and the ability or the capacity to be able to make decisions is not necessarily an ability to have at that time. So what's going on? They may be having the flashbacks. They may be having those terrorized feelings where certain pictures, certain environments, certain people, or certain type of people might trigger that, And so it takes time for that brain to kind of be coerced back, to be supported, and that brain to have, and that person to be supported in such a way so they can start to think about safety again, so their brain can start to function properly again. And so it's really interesting what the impact that can possibly happen on certain folks with partner violence. So any comments, any questions there? I know I've given you a lot right there. So if I were to tell you that brain looked like a veteran, that makes kind of sense. Like right away, we can tell that. Well, I want you to consider that brain can be the brain of someone who's had partner violence over a long period of time. Everyone feels and gets impacted at different degrees because we're all different people. So different people might be able to get to that place. And so when we think about why somebody stays, or when we offer options why somebody will still stay, well, maybe that's part of it. Maybe they just don't have the capacity just yet to be able to really mitigate what those potential options might have to entail, and what they might or might not do. Teresa.
Hi. A lot of research lately, you're talking about the brain, a lot of research lately about concussions. They're looking at women's brains the way they look at athletes' brains, like football players. This constant being hit in the head, it's causing long-term effects that they hadn't looked at before. And there's a lot of research on that right now, which I find really interesting.
Yeah. The effects of it years afterwards. It reminds me of what is that situation that was found out to football? Oh, that's the ex-Steeler guy. Will Smith played his part, and there's a certain, it escapes me right now. It has to do with traumatic brain injury, in this particular situation. And so women or men who have been victims of long-term partner violence are very much in a position to actually have those type of situations too. Go ahead, Emily Zanya.
Me? Was it my turn?
Yes.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I also find this intersection between brain injury and intimate partner violence and substance abuse really fascinating. We know with lack of oxygen, it takes 5 minutes, we start to see cell death. And we have clients that are overdosing on fentanyl, being revived from Narcan dozens of times. How many of us have heard from clients, oh, I was just unconscious for 45 minutes and woke up. And knowing the repercussions of that frontal cortex injury and ability to make good decisions, and so I think it's definitely something that, as clinicians, we keep in mind, the rates of brain injury in these populations, some of the studies put them over 50%. It's almost like we should be using universal precautions.
Yeah. I know what happens a lot of times with a lot of us is that the current social issue is what we kind of focus our time and efforts for, and a lot of times we get funded for. Despite that we had a pandemic, despite that we're still kind of coming out of it, we're not completely out of it, but despite that we're coming out of that, despite that we are supposed to address the substance use issues, with our clients, we can't forget that these other potential issues are really impacting them as well. So it kind of speaks, and I like your points, Emily. I think it kind of speaks to what are the screening tools, what are the screening processes that we are integrating in our practices. And I know we have certain things that we do ahead of time. I always bring up the point of we do mental health evaluations at the beginning. It's part of the eligibility criteria, it's part of the protocols for when someone gets admitted to treatment. I get that. But we do mental health evaluations. They're not necessarily accurate at the beginning if they just finished their using, if they just finished maybe 2 or 3 weeks before that. The other thing is these different parts of the brain that I was showing you of what, PTSD affects, those are the same parts of the brain as substance use affects. So think of it like a double whammy. It's very hard for that person. So it's hard for even our wonderful clinical instruments that we use in our protocols. We're not always picking up right from the beginning what might be happening with someone. So kind of being mindful of behavioral indicators, potential links to perhaps while you build that rapport and that engagement skill with your clients. So to be able to kind of start to elicit information that might be very specific to past history that you may not have captured on your documentation, might be really helpful because we got to support them as we go along. Also, another reason why we talk a lot about no matter what you do, what capacity you do it, you should be trauma informed. Just in short, you should be trauma informed. The movie I was talking about was Concussion, I think. And Will Smith played the part of the doctor who discovered this potential issue with TBI. There was an ex-dealer who had gone, he was so psychologically messed up that he had his family relationships. He was very hostile, he couldn't control himself a lot of times. He had a lot of little different impacts in his mind. A lot of these folks are leaving their brains are being studied, and this is how we found out how the damage could be later on. So what you mentioned, so what Teresa was mentioning about, how we're finding out more because we're finding out it's not just somebody who's been banged around in a football field. It's not just people in combat theater. And sometimes it's not just men and women who are victims of long-term partner violence. And so these different things can be impactful. So what does that mean for what we do? We have to assess people, evaluate them, work with their immediate issues to help stabilize them and address the substance use. But if you're not aware of these other pertaining issues that might start to come up later on as their mind evolves, as that fog lifts, as they relearn new skills, that might make you work twice as hard, and they might lose the opportunity. They may not even understand why certain ideas, certain visions are coming back, certain memories are coming back, why they behave a certain way, why they stay away from certain things. We have to be mindful of that so we can educate them on that. Tamika?
As you were talking about the movie, I love watching movies, but then that's also a good movie for something else. So I Googled, are you talking about the movie Concussion?
Yeah, Concussion.
Okay. Just
I
wanted
believe that's the one.
Yeah, I said, 2015 Concussion. Okay, thank you. Just wanted to know.
Yeah, great movie. Super great movie because especially when it's a movie based on a true story, you really want to know. It gives a lot of insight. It also kind of speaks to the hush-hush environment, of the culture of the organization, which is not dissimilar from society in general. So society in general, we tend to judge from what we see. And so when a woman is partnered with a man who has, all this going on for him, he's maybe an example for the community. He's a kind of leader, heaven forbid anybody would say that. He's a veteran. Nah, he can't be, especially when they don't see bruises on him, right? That kind of reminds me of Hedda Nussbaum and Joe Steinberg and that situation from many, many years ago, a lawyer and all that. And she was so beat up that she couldn't help herself. She couldn't help the girl, the little girl, Lisa Steinberg, who died. So when we think about all that, we're just looking to see what are the potential issues that can be presenting or they may have had experience with, and how that would impact their life today as you're helping them. Since you have the treatment plan for them, since you're helping to support them as they move along. So let me go back to my slides and let's talk about this. I know I don't have too much time. Let me see. How to screen. So the suggestions are, let's consider some of the sociocultural factors for any given person. Culture can play a huge part on whether someone is able to express to you, what's going on. So it falls on you and how you elicit information. So sometimes cultural norms perpetrate the problem. And if someone has culturally learned not to express themselves, to not share intimate, the things that happen in the family, stay in the family, that's just another barrier for you to get through. Doesn't mean that's impossible. It just means that that's possible, and that might be part of it. There's another thing, and I mentioned concussions because it was based on a true story. But the other thing is, there's so many misrepresentation of the media on intimate partner violence. Listen, I don't know anybody who's going to do what J-Lo did in that picture and go in and get some money and go get trained and then end up, having to take him out. I just think it's so irresponsible to mislead the public like that. I just think it's so irresponsible. I got nothing against the girl. I lived on the other side of the block from where she used to live. I've got nothing against the girl. But the storyline itself, I don't think it helps victims. That's my personal and professional opinion, because when I know my clients look at these things to be informed, to get empowered, this is not necessarily realistic. This can set someone up for some real hurtful situations. So misrepresentations, I'm going to speak about intimate partner violence, speak to what it is, and don't mislead. The person's personal and cultural perspectives can be part of how they express themselves, perhaps plays a part of why they stay. Their generation perceptions on this. There are some generations that maybe some older generations in some cultural groups, or maybe even the dominant culture. It might be some perceptions that include, you're in a situation, you're legally married, you're supposed to be married for the rest of your life, you're part of the community. Whatever the generational perceptions are, that might play a part. Yeah, same gender relationships. We've had a big challenge trying to get law enforcement or some type of help, when they are minimized or belittled because they're same gender relationships. Cultural views of IPV can be maladaptive. And so, understanding some of these dynamics can be helpful when you're screening someone. So this happened in 2021. And I think some of you may be familiar with this. This is just barely a year ago. So you folks remember, let me see, Andrea Ruiz, no, this one was different. Andrea Ruiz was 35, was denied a restraining order. Despite the fact that her abuse was described in a very descriptive way, she did go get help. She did describe graphically the situation she was in. 30 days later, she was married by her abuser. So this reiterates what I said from the beginning. 25% of victims who do leave their situations end up being a homicidal victim. This one most of us are familiar with. Keishla Marlon Rodriguez, 27, was killed by boxer, up-and-coming boxer Felix Verdejo Sanchez. There was a whole saga with that one. He was married, and oh man, there's a whole bunch of things that happened with that one. They actually took the body and then tried to dump it, I think, in the river somewhere in Puerto Rico. This is stuff that happened recently. This still is a very prevalent issue. We shouldn't ignore it or put it, shove it under the table. We know that opioid is running rampant. We know overdoses are happening so much. I just want to make sure that we understand that this is also part of the problem. So potential signs of abuse. Someone may seem afraid or anxious to please their partner. Maybe someone is nervous about speaking to any questions relating to their partners. That might be a red flag for us to explore. Go along with everything what their partner says. If they have to be, you ever had an interview with someone, with your client, and then the client has the partner there, and the partner's doing the speaking. And the client will, no, the client doesn't want to speak to you without the partner. So those things are red flags. You check in with person who checks in with the partner often to report where they are, what they're doing. They're always on the phone or always to be in constant contact with their partner. If they're talking about their partner's jealousy or their volatile approach. This I'm going to bypass right now because one of the things just very briefly, I just want to say that anytime we engage anyone, this is what you should be doing. It doesn't matter what problem, just any new client, you should really consider always having an atmosphere that is trauma-informed, is culturally responsive, that is affirming, because folks are coming in from a hard place. They're coming into treatment. This is like almost a 90-day type of situation for people. Imagine if you have the partner violence issue in the past, you know, we need to be more inspired and more supportive and when we engage with them. And the first impression is very important. You only get that opportunity one time. And so trauma-informed care, it's really something that organizations do, but it's something as us as individual providers that we practice as well. You know, we always want to emphasize the physical, psychological, and emotional well-being and safety for our clients. So we want to be preventive in our approaches and how we interact. Tasha May, go ahead.
One thing that I was waiting to hear if you address is for those victims who are with someone who has power, for example, a police officer, a judge, a lawyer. Is there a different approach to work with folks like that?
You know, you got to meet everybody where they're at. One of the things I was just talking about was that Joel Steinberger was a very famous lawyer, and nobody believed that he was the one who ended up killing his little girl, Lisa Steinberg. And I know that's a very old case, but that might make it harder for that person to be believed, but it's not impossible. So really, if you're working with your client and you're doing screening and you have potential resources to offer, it's more about helping her work with an organization that can work around those factors and those dynamics and what she or he needs to do. So it's very individualized, you know, but it's that person gets help too. Everybody gets help if they want it, you know. It's a matter of you linking them to that resource. Does that help?
Yes, and the other way around, what if the victim's perpetrator is a police officer or someone of high stature? Like, is there any way to deal with that, or we just still go the same way, just a matter of being careful, I guess, in how we approach a situation?
It really depends on the details of that situation. It really depends, and you know, the options available, what they are willing to, what they are open to considering, and the dynamics of that situation. Because I mean, you could get a protected, an order of protection from a police officer as well. It doesn't matter, you know, what they do. You can get an order of protection from a judge if that's your partner, you know. So the reality is, it might have more. It might seem that they're out of resources, but law enforcement is not the only resource. And let me put it that way. There are a lot of other organizations. If you think about, oh geez, what is that? The organization, Safe Horizons, right? Like that's just a site, one organization. What these places tend to do is have all those different resources available where they can tailor them according to the needs of that individual. Very, very individualized, and all contingent upon whether or not they're willing to kind of follow through. Okay. You know, what they think they can do. Sometimes it's just about us providing the resource and the information now, and they can consider it and come to us later. And we keep them supported in the intro.
Okay, thank you. So
trauma-informed practice, we know a little bit about that. Let me just talk about screening. Screening and assessment with an IPV trauma lens, understanding intersections, understanding responses, understanding culture, understanding that there's a lot of different intersecting factors for any given individual. And so the trauma-informed approach to screening and assessment of relationships, it's really about how we connect, how we initiate. This should be normal. This should be for everyone, but how we connect with a given individual and how we ask questions in a trauma-informed way. You know, not with blame, not with stigma, not with judgment. It's really, really important to this. So what does it take to do that? Understanding trauma. You know, go to your trauma trainings. The intimate partner violence, this is just quick, short, and dirty. 90-minute presentation. I do have longer presentations where we go into it a lot more in depth, and that makes sense. And there's a lot of information on the web that's available. But if you understand all these intersecting factors, you have a better idea how to approach a client and ask questions and support them on what, maybe just giving them information, even if they shared about a situation they're in and they don't want to do anything about it now. And you can still support them where they're at. So sometimes when we do the screenings, if someone responds no to these questions about safety, there's nothing wrong with you adding, like, I see that you checked no to these questions about, partner violence. If about questions related to feeling safe with your partner. Do you have any other questions for me? No? Okay, so I want you to know, just in case, if you ever wanted to talk about it, this is a safe place that you can talk about it with. So what they may not come to you with today, they may tell you later. So you may want to ask indirectly. Sometimes we want to frame the questions. I want to get to a certain part. I want to go to safe screening here. When I was doing HIV prevention work, we were taught, and this is, oh gosh, I'm dating myself, 2005, 2006. We had to learn how to create a safety plan for someone, to help somebody. We didn't have to be clinicians to do this. So we had to understand, how do we screen for their stress and their safety level? Do they feel safe in their relationship? Have their partner ever threatened them or their children? Or, have they abused them? If they were hurt, do you have an outlet? Do you have a resource? Would your friends or family know? Is there someone that you can count on? If there's how to do an emergency plan, do you have a safe place to go to an emergency? Do you need help in locating a shelter? I had a client who had, who was in a relationship at the time we were doing, and this one was an HIV prevention program I was working in. And her partner was in the program also with another counselor and another case manager. And I was asking her this question. She didn't want to leave her situation. And it wasn't about comparing whether it was so bad or not so bad. This was her choice. But I still would have to ask her this periodically. And if she did have, and I asked her if there was an emergency, you needed to go somewhere. Do you have a place you would go that he does not know about? And so these are really, really important questions. So there's some screening tools that some folks use, that organizations tend to use. And unfortunately, I'm not very fond of the acronym ITS, but it's one that is used very commonly. It stands for hurt, insult, threaten, and scream. But these are screening tools that can be self-administered. You don't necessarily have to ask them person for person. They can do it themselves. And then, there are certain times when we do screening before we do official intakes, or even after we do intakes over the phone or in person, there's some paperwork that sometimes we have our clients fill out. We can have our clients fill out these questions too. So the HIT kind of covers this. And let me go through here. There are different interventions and counseling opportunities, danger assessment tool. Most interventions, you need to have your referral sources in place. Know where you can refer to mental health, understand what are your resources for if someone wanted to get out of their intimate violence relationship and then living on hand. Find out what are those organizations, learn just a little bit of what kind of resources they offer, because if someone does ask you, you're able to provide them that information. And safety planning. And safety planning can be a lot of different things. It's not always leaving the space. Becoming familiar with safe places where the individual can go to at times when things seem to be very hostile, where he or she and the kids, or he or she can just go. Create a code word for when they need to get out of the situation immediately, and who are the resources that would know those code words? Is there a person they can count on? Keep computer safety in mind. If they're researching their resources, make sure there's lock and key, in those settings. What is there a support network? Kind of, if there's a way to prepare an excuse in the midst of a moment where she or he may feel that they have to leave, understand how to do that. For me, a lot of what we had to learn when I was an HIV prevention manager was how to help someone feel safe at home. So it's not necessarily about leaving the immediate space, but in the home, get familiar with the home, talk with your client, Of all places, if you can't go, of all places in your house, when hostility starts to arise, what is the safest place in your house? Where is it that where you will get the least amount of hurt done to you? And so it's different from being in the kitchen with a knife as opposed to being in a bedroom where there are pillows. So safety planning can be like that. And you got to meet your client where they're at, so you have to provide them options. So that's one of them. So, I'm going to put in the chat box, I have something here. Let's see, safety planning. So I put in there a safety planning, it's a PDF document. It's still this same link. It's a personalized safety plan. It's a few pages. If you have clients who are dealing with the situation and they are considering, their options, and you can run through these questions with them. The thing is to identify their needs, understand their choices, their feelings, their capacity, understanding that their capacity may be likely compromised, work with what they tell you. So you got to work within their strengths and their current capacity now. It's not so much what we see. It's not so much what we can do. It's not so much what we've helped other people to do. It's where we can meet them where they're at and help them where they're at. So understand what experiences are contributing to their health problems, the substance abuse, I should say substance use, the mental health issues, help them understand where they can access services for themselves and their children at any given time, inform them and support them in their right to be healthy and safe. So making effective referrals include, just make sure you have it and within your reach, that what are the medical services that this person may be able to go to. Now think about this, knowing what your catchment area is and your clients and where they live, also consider that that some of these resources need not be in the immediate place where they live. Not any place where the perpetrator can easily find them. So ensure that you have resources both in the immediate area and outside area. In less likely areas where the perpetrator may find the individual while they're getting their help. Law enforcement agencies, there's a lot of precincts that do have a domestic violence officer who work specifically with these cases. A lot of them don't, but some do. What are the legal assistance resources that are available? Assistance programs, support groups, even support groups that may be for victims of intimate partner violence. It could be closed groups, even on social media. That might be the easiest access for some folks who are victims. And I not kind of rushed through at the end, you have a lot of good resources in that last slide. Just really quickly, I want to ask, is there any questions? I know this is kind of packed, wasn't it? So we have 90 minutes. I thank you for your time here. Mika, what can I do for you? You can unmute yourself.
Yes, hi. I'm loving this so much. But my question is, I have a client who has been court ordered to participate in a perpetrator domestic violence group or treatment plan. And all of the ones here in my area, Missouri, they are just listed as a domestic violence group or training. And I haven't found anyone specific to the batterer or the perpetrator that is titled as such. What do you recommend?
You know what happened? Well, I know in New York, what we used to do is some of those perpetrator groups actually exist within law enforcement, within the criminal justice system. So have you looked into the criminal justice system there? So I know there's a group in New York where one of my clients went to. He was actually labeled was it a SORA? A SORA person, someone he has. This is where they send folks who have like 10 or 20 years as a sexual offender, and they have these specific classes. So try your criminal justice and reach out to also the links that I gave you here in the slides, the domestic violence organization. Look at those links there. They have a lot of different organizations throughout the country, so they may be able to give you some direction as to who's available in your area. And if you don't find any, shoot me an email and I'll help you find some.
Okay, and then piggyback to that one is, I find that some of the domestic violence classes cover some of the same material, maybe not, about the power and control cycle And I'm seeing these recommendations. Thank you guys so much. But do you think they can get anything out of going to a domestic violence side?
What, the perpetrator, you mean?
Mhm. Or is that?
I believe that's part of what they get in those groups. I don't see, I think the more information, I think they will probably see themselves in there. I'm not going to give you a clinical opinion because I'm not there. That's not who I am. To kind of get them into a training that kind of shows this is what they already do. You know, I think, and maybe it might be more effective to have this space for providers and maybe victims who start to understand that this is part of their dynamics, and have them in groups where it's specific to helping them learn how to arrest that behavior that they have.
Okay, I appreciate it. Thank you so much.
All right, Gladys, go ahead. One more and then we got to go. Yeah, you got it, almost got it. There you go.
Normally, the legal system send the perpetrator to get groups. The domestic violence group of the perpetrator, they very good, very good. Normally, it's 10 people. I used to see those groups.
Okay. Well, folks, next time when I think I'll do a Snyder Shorty. I do have another 90-minute coming up, but I'm going to do a more extended one where we could do some more group process. And I appreciate all the experience and expertise that you brought to here. Thank you so much, everyone, for being here.